Order, please.
Madam President, now that cloture has been invoked on the substitute bill, we are one step closer to completing this product, which has been the subject of bipartisan negotiation with the White House for quite some time. I know a lot of hard work has been put into this, and I want to thank all of our colleagues who have contributed to it. After much anticipation, we finally received the bill text earlier this week. There was a lot of what we expected to see. Madam President, I'd ask for order.
Senate be in order. Please take your conversations out of the chamber.
After much anticipation, we finally received the text of the bill earlier this week. Of course, a lot of it was what we expected to see: funding for roads, bridges, ports, waterways, airports, and broadband. Under normal circumstances, an infrastructure bill would go through a long and arduous committee process before ever coming to the floor. Members of the committees of jurisdiction would have an opportunity to debate and offer amendments and get votes on their proposals to try to improve the bill at the committee level. This provides a very important part of the ability of everybody to be able to participate in the process, one that is denied members of the committees of relevant jurisdiction when a bill comes to the floor already negotiated. So one of the challenges is when you have 20 people who agree on something and then they bring it to the floor, and of course then the 80 who have not been part of that discussion want to participate and want to try to improve the underlying bill. So I hope that now that the cloture on the substitute has been invoked, there'll be an opportunity for us to vote on some additional amendments. I've been working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to identify new pay-fors that could be adopted as amendments. And we've come up with some good ideas that I hope can receive votes now, even post-cloture. But I want to talk specifically about an amendment that I've worked on with Senator Padilla, the junior senator from California, to fund infrastructure projects in communities across our country without increasing the deficit. Our amendment simply gives states and local governments the flexibility to use unspent COVID relief funding on infrastructure projects. Right now, there are limitations that we put on that funding. Of course, at the time those limitations or guardrails were put on that funding, we didn't know how long this pandemic would last or what the actual needs were of the various states and local jurisdictions. So qualifying expenses include things that are directly related to the pandemic, like COVID-19 testing sites, vaccine PSAs, and additional bed space for hospitals. But here's the rub. That funding cannot be used on expenses unrelated to the pandemic or items that were previously included in a budget. There must be new pandemic-related expenses. In theory, and at the time, that made a lot of sense. After all, this funding was meant to bolster the fight against COVID-19 in our communities. But not every community has the same need. In many places, the most urgent needs aren't related to the pandemic because they have not been hit quite as hard as others, unfortunately, around the country. But some of their most urgent needs are what we're talking about here today: infrastructure, roads and bridges and the like.
Senate will be in order.
We all know that the pandemic has interrupted infrastructure improvements across the country, and it forced officials to put many of these projects on the back burner. Maintenance, repairs, and construction projects have been put on hold, as you know, until there was enough funding to get things back on track. I've heard from my constituents in Texas, state and local leaders, who are frustrated by this lack of flexibility with the federal funding that they've already received or which they expect to receive. They simply like the option, not a mandate, but an option to use this money when and where it's needed most. But as I say, right now, their hands are tied. Many states and localities have relief funds on hand, but no necessary qualifying expenses. Madam President, the Senate is still not in order.
The Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations outside the chamber.
Many states, as I say, have relief funds on hand, but no necessary qualifying expenses. They have to look at this big balance in their bank account, knowing they can't actually spend it on some of their most urgent needs. That's especially the case in rural parts of the country, in places where COVID numbers are thankfully low. Leaders don't have the need or the opportunity to spend this money, which we've already appropriated, on the timeline set within that legislation. They simply don't have a need for the full range of pandemic-related resources that might be necessary in some parts of the country with higher case counts. So the amendment that Senator Padilla and I have offered would simply give leaders in rural and urban areas alike, where appropriate, the option to spend the funding on necessary infrastructure projects. That could mean widening a highway, making safety improvements on a bridge, or expanding broadband access. Urban areas could even use these funds for public transit improvement projects. State and local leaders know the needs of their community better than any of us here, and they should have the flexibility to spend that money where it's needed most. But Madam President, I think we've had a recent bit of evidence of how long it takes for Congress to act before the money that we appropriate actually gets to the intended beneficiary. And to me, nothing is more exemplary of that than the eviction moratorium. Congress appropriated $46 billion in rent relief, but if you look around the country, many of the intended beneficiaries of that rent relief have not yet seen that money, thus the movement toward extending the moratorium. And I know just from my own experience in Texas after Hurricane Harvey, where Congress appropriated billions of dollars in relief, it's taken literally years for the money to come from Washington, D.C. to get to the intended beneficiary. So that's one of the biggest benefits of the amendment that Senator Padilla and I have offered, is this money is readily available and does not, again, as I said, add to the deficit or debt, but merely provides them flexibility, which means they will be able to put that money to use more quickly on infrastructure projects. Again, this is not a mandate. This is an option. Any place that has new COVID expenses to cover can and should use the money they have for that purpose. There's no question about that. But we simply give leaders the option to spend relief funds on urgent infrastructure projects that may otherwise go unfunded. Here's the other problem, Madam President, is I know that many of our state and local leaders are sitting on these huge amounts of financial resources we've appropriated, and they're figuring out, well, if we don't spend it on something, then the federal government's going to claw it back, or it may not just qualify for the expenditures that are already authorized. And so they will be under a lot of pressure to spend it on things that may be simply operating expenses, may not provide the long-term economic benefit that an infrastructure project would. So that's another benefit of giving them this flexibility, is that it will incentivize them to spend the money on the types of things we would hope they would spend the money on if they don't need it for COVID-19. Well, back in March, nearly 36 organizations wrote to Secretary Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, urging her to make transportation infrastructure an eligible expense. They talked about the impact of COVID-19 on transportation revenue and noted that last year 18 states and 24 localities announced delays or cancellations of transportation improvement projects totaling more than $12 billion. They also noted that the pandemic impacted every state and community differently, something that should be self-evident, and asked for the flexibility which they said will be critical to ensuring the funds are used expeditiously and with maximum impact. President Biden's own transportation secretary has also suggested as much. In In his testimony before Congress, Secretary Buttigieg said that the American Rescue Plan has some flexibility in it that he thinks could be used to support road budgets that have been impacted. States and cities shouldn't be able to spend this money. They should be able to invest it in the projects and resources they need the most. This is just simply common sense that I think all of us can get behind. It ensures that money that has already gone out the door, which will not add to our deficit or debt, will be used to the maximum impact before the sunset brings that flexibility and that money, those resources, to an end. And it puts decision-making at the local level. Local officials understand better than people in Washington, D.C., what they need the most, and this gives them the flexibility to put that money to the most efficient and most effective use. This amendment's earned the support of a broad range of organizations across the country, and I'm proud to have worked with Senator Padilla to craft an amendment that both sides can get behind. Today, I hope this will be one of the amendments to receive a vote on the floor. We have to ensure that infrastructure investments are made fairly and paid for responsibly. A robust amendment process and common sense bipartisan ideas like this one are the only way to get there. Madam President, I yield the floor.